Good evening. Let's resume our afternoon or evening session as part of the World Bioethics Conference. Erin Williams will join us later. Can you hear me?
¿Se oye mejor ahora?
Better now?
Muy bien.
Great, then.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. As I was saying, we will move on according to the agenda that we had planned for this World Bioethics Conference. Erin Williams hasn't joined us yet. My name is Antonio Vigili. I'm DG for the Principalities Radio and Television Broadcasting Channel, and I would like to thank the organizing committee for allowing me to be here with you today. Let me introduce Miguel Lorente, who is the speaker today. He has got a degree in medicine and surgery from the University of Granada, an expert in legal and forensic medicine, and has a master's in bioethics and law from the University of Barcelona. He is now a professor for legal medicine, toxicology, and physical anthropology at the University of Granada. He is an expert in looking into interpersonal violence and especially gender-based violence. He has published over 80 studies in international and national magazines for forensic sciences and has worked with different international governments and institutions in the fight against violence against women, such as WHO, to have a medical legal action protocol for caring for sexual violence victims. He has published several books on the topic, some of which, such as violence against women, mistreat, abuse, harassment, my husband only hits me, what's normal, the puzzle, the anatomy of the abuser, and the new man. These would all be titles in Spanish, by the way. He's held different positions such as DG for the Medical Institute in Granada. He was also a law expert helping victims of GBV in Andalusia and also a government delegate for GBV since April 2008 to December 2011. We will now give him the floor and he will explain gender-based violence in intimate partnerships. You have the floor. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Antonio, for your kind words. And I would also like to thank the organizing committee, especially Dr. Palacios, for his invitation that has helped me be here at this International or World Bioethics Conference, and especially for approaching from the International Bioethics Society this topic of violence against women and its relationship with bioethics and ethics. I think it is significant. And in that regard, I have to say that the result of violence is so drastic, so terrible, that we look for a solution from the end. But the only way to eliminate it is to go deeper into its roots and address that beginning, that starting point that is a structure in our society, so that we can make sure we can eradicate it, eliminate all the arguments, all the elements, all the references existing and leading to the fact that so many men turn to violence to stay at a superior level within society and within intimate partnerships. And because there is a need to look into this problem from a different perspective, contrary to what happens with legal or forensic medicine or psychology. And this is it. This is a bioethics conference, and that's why I've tried to arrange a series of ideas I would like to share with you and try and see if we come to any conclusion or that we can draw with each other so that we can go deeper into the roots and get them out of this growing field that is the sexist culture. And let's start with what happened yesterday in Seville with another murder, another homicide that is gender-based violence, showing that this is a current affairs, this is a present problem that we haven't overcome, that we have made no progress in all those elements I said exist, to try and understand what's happening. That result is the most patent result, what we know best. But if we go to international studies, we see that when we say GBV prevalence in intimate partnerships, the WHO states that 30% of all women in the planet will suffer at some time, at some point in their lives, some kind of aggression or assault within an intimate partnership. Just within that partnership, 30% of all women endure violence exerted by those men they are linked to in a so-called emotional relationship or love-based relationship. As a consequence of that violence in intimate partnerships, different continent figures vary, but we see that there are 50,000 murders, 49,000 plus murders of women. There is gender-based violence in intimate partnerships. So every 10 minutes, a woman is murdered by her partner or former partner as a consequence of GBV. If we were to just look into this result, we would know quite a bit of the problem, and yet we would leave aside something very important as well. And just by changing the reference to data, it gives us a good perspective, brings us closer to what GBV actually is. If we say 30% of all men abuse women all over the world, women they are in an intimate relationship with, we see the same reality, but we change the approach. That is the number of men that, because of their culture, they use their stance to exert such behavior. If we say that as a consequence of such violence, every 10 minutes a man kills, murders their partner or former partner, we get to know that situation in a much more complete way. But yet, even if we know the result, even if we see the root and source of behaviors, that's not enough to understand why those men, such a percentage of men, so 50,000 men every year end up killing their wives. Why do they do it? We still don't know. And for that, we need to understand that when we say sexism, it's not an excess of regular behaviors in society, but it is the inequality is sexism itself. And sometimes the criticism in society focus on some results that, because of their characteristics or features, go above what is considered normal, regular, ordinary, or admissible at a given time. And that link to sexism, to excess, means that inequality stays unquestioned as part of the references that articulate relationships within society. Furthermore, this inequality is no accident, it's no coincidence, no drifting happening in time, but it's an interested building, a construction. When we say inequality, when we say sexism or macho chauvinism, this is an artifact for those who are in a higher position, those who are a reference. They enjoy advantages when conditioning the reality itself and when sorting out conflicts that happen within reality itself. So sexism equals inequality, and inequality is a power basis in the benefit of those who've designed the system itself, who've designed the model itself. And this situation did not come up with globalization or climate change or migrations that happened. It is actually in the origin of the social organization of our own identity. When we look into the source of this kind of behaviors, Joseph Bauer, the philosopher, has stated that back in the Neolithic age, conflict resolution in an interested way happened for those who were at a powerful position within the group. So these are groups of human beings, people, groups that did not exceed 30 people in number. And back then, they were always the conflicts were sorted out beneficially for the group. But when we say some changes after the Neolithic, there were a few people, men, using powerful position or enriching through accumulation of the agricultural production to try and sort out conflicts in a beneficial way. So power as itself starts with injustice is unfair from the beginning because it doesn't look for an agreed upon result, but it tries to impose a series of criteria, references, in order to preserve some advantages when addressing conflicts that may arise. And that from the Neolithic, they started having some powerful condition. It was their condition and not circumstances that led to their power, based on which there was a whole system built, trying to make it real, trying to turn it into a society model when it was actually based on injustice that had to do with coexisting and power references. And if we look into culture, our current situation, we see that culture is all about knowledge. Quite often we link culture to arts creation, literature, music, the arts, but those are expressions of culture. Culture, as it is defined, it is the build-up of ideas, inventions, knowledge, all in all, that is used as a reference for the whole society and around which we organize coexistence. Frank de Waal has a nice culture definition which is very graphic and simple. The non-genetic expansion of habits and information. There is information for the human being, that is what we have in our genes, but everything else we learn from the outside through coexisting in a society. That is culture, that is knowledge. And Frank de Waal states this is a learning process mediatized by others, so it is a social component. Without society, without coexisting, we will not have reached to knowledge through culture. We would be acculturized, or we would have some trouble trying to assimilate this shared knowledge. And so knowledge comes from coexisting. So it's quite simple. If culture equals knowledge, if it's knowledge that we learn from society, and if society is made up of men and women, then clearly we could come to a conclusion that we actually do not have a culture. We have some kind of pseudo-culture, some kind of him-my culture, because this experience belonging to women, their perception, their vision, women's experience throughout history has not been included to that shared knowledge. It's been left aside to some spaces that are only homebound, where other men would make sure that knowledge would be accommodating to what they thought should be, to their family relation model, to their model of society, as a matter of fact. So inequality would be constructing that hierarchy based on male references, taking what's male as universal and feminine as particular individual. And if said culture construction that it's based on what men think it's adequate for coexistence, for what's social, it's all been made based on knowledge. And on top of that, we've had to use a series of values, references, and standards that are a bit more transcending or higher, morally called moral to build it. So this inequality has led to an immoral moral, meaning that all the guidelines that we set up for coexisting, for behaving within society, have always been based in what men considered should be set relationships as part of a society and individually as well. So we have that starting vice, which means that nowadays when we face gender-based violence as a result, when we approach GBV as a social problem, as a social situation, we cannot just stay at the last expression of violence, a man attacking a woman at a given time and with a different result. And why is that? Because such behavior, it has been built for its purpose within the partnership context. The target, the purpose, the why this happens is highly conditioned or contingent on the experience that has happened within a social context that justifies violence to achieve a given purpose. Motivation is born out of a social context that is wider. And said context, social context, is influenced by those cultural references that have an impact on what's moral and what's behavioral. And that behavioral meaning comes from inequality built by gender references or gender-based references. So if a culture understands there are reasons to use violence in order to achieve given purposes, these would be a construction that goes beyond what's individual, and so the solution could never be addressed just to what's individual, because that would only tackle that last part, this final expression that is nuanced by a series of factors that are very specific and different from each other. If it's an 80-year-old killing his wife, it's so different from an 18-year-old murdering his 16-year-old girlfriend, and yet they're same social and cultural elements. So this social construction somehow has allowed to build some kind of a normal condition. And so women within an unequal society find themselves vulnerable, because their references as the one we see in this Eurobarometer on gender differences, where 2% women in the European Union consider violence is acceptable in some cases or circumstances, and 1% considers violence is acceptable in every circumstance. That's our society, that's our culture. These are our moral references to justify violence as a way of addressing conflicts that might come up within an intimate partnership when we say GBV instead context. And this translates into specific results. And according to the last survey from 2015, we see 44% of all women that do not report say they do not because violence they suffer is not serious enough, it's not severe enough. They don't say they are not victims of violence, but they are victims of violence, but it's not serious enough as to report it. And this is the same sentence that back in '88 I heard from many abused women. Yes, my husband beats me up, just what's regular, but today he went too far. So they were questioning the amount of violence, not violence itself. And it's 2015, well, rather 2016 now, and the reference not changed, that a given amount of violence is only normal, it is only acceptable. And when we go beyond that, there is an option for report. What we get from reporting it's different, but 21% of all women say they do not report it because they feel ashamed. They're saying that society, culture lead to that shameful feeling in women who are victims of GBV. And why is that? Because somehow society, culture, this sexist culture has said that abused women are bad women, bad mothers, bad wives, poor midwives. So if I report that I've been beaten by my husband, I'm saying that I'm a bad woman, a bad mother, and a poor midwife. And so I feel ashamed, because when I get robbed or attacked in a different context, I feel no shame, I feel no problem reporting it. But it's different when the attacker is my husband. And this is a construction based on that cultural reference. But we also said there's something else when we say that it is normal because there are some references. This women, it means vulnerability, risk, and risk of violence happening, but for attackers, it becomes impunity for them. And we see data from a year back, 600,000 cases we see in the macro survey, yearly macro survey in Spain, is translated into some 20 to 22% reports, out of which sentences happen only for 20% of all those cases. So if we compare the total number of sentences, punishing sentences, with the number of cases, it is quite obvious. Impunity. What happens is impunity. Sorry, Miguel, I have to rush you to have Q&A later on. How much time? Left 5 minutes, stop. Good. Well, as I was saying, impunity. Said impunity in the end means that an abuser, an attacker, does not feel that something will come to him, that violent situation will become a negative situation for him. And so the abuser is the absent figure, both for the source or origin, because we always look into what women do or do not do, even when they are murdered. Institutional statements, it's been a report, it's not been a report, who cares? Right there, who should question the women's behavior on reporting habits? But there is no questioning on the abuser, whether they were lying in his own context to come closer to his wife and kill her. So they are always absent, they are always missing, instead of being held accountable. And now ethics. When we have a professional response studied, we see how 14% of all women who reported, or somehow there is a report of violence, this is done by professionals who are in contact or relatives who are in contact with the violent situations. So you see a scarce percentage of response in the medical care. It's only 9% for injuries, when it's actually much more common that women go to the doctor because of violent case. So it is professionals that need to take these violence problems. The same happens with courts. Now we see this is the highest figure. 43% of all women who have been murdered had already reported it, filed a report, and this has not been translated into a greater degree of protection. And this is the highest percentage of women murdered after filing a report, which means that the response has not been fully adequate, since we cannot focus on this final individual context, and we need to consider everything that is social and cultural, that is what is gender conditioned. This is a deficitary response even by institutions. And I'm about to finish. We need to understand that who kills is sexism, chauvinism. Then there are sexists within the culture that carry out the plan to use violence and to morally claim homicide as a way to empower themselves and claim themselves as men. And that means that every year there are new men who murder women, because those who murder this year will not be murderers next year. They either kill themselves or are imprisoned. But every year we have 60 new men ready to kill their wives. And this is not coming out of nowhere. There's no other criminal activity so serious where we see a systematic reproduction of the same result year after year. There's no criminal group, there is no gang that has 60 homicides with the same victim profile. And this is fed naturally by that culture and sexism. How come when there are some given violent behaviors such as terrorism, Islamic terrorism, it is understood that it's jihadism and not jihadists themselves? And yet when we say GBV, we don't understand it is macho chauvinism, and we narrow it down just to some sexist men. This is a problem. Trying to understand it, to understand the reality of the problem. So this is translated, as we see, in the fact that the number of homicides at world level in serious circumstances is going down, as we see through organized crime gangs, and yet the GBV murders are not going down, and even more, they've been increasing in recent years. It makes no sense that we can find the most sophisticated and complex criminality, and yet we cannot help that violence, those homicides that are happening next door. It makes no sense at all, unless we look at it from a point of view of the cultural perspective that I mentioned. And that's why we need to trust our culture, because it is true that power has turned to culture in order to lead to that domination and normality and use of violence to get advantages and privileges. But it is also true that power cannot control culture as a whole. And the uncontrolled part is equality. The main enemy to power is equality. And from equality, we need to fight off this unfair sexist power or patriarchy power, because this is the only way to eliminate GBV. Otherwise, we will find homicides as a result, violence as a result, but that result will never be an accident, a coincidence. It will be a consequence of what we've done or not done. Reality is no accident. It's a result of what we do or not do. If we work for equality and peace, we will get a society where coexistence is not translated into violence. If we do not, we will still have gender-based violence. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Miguel.
Thank you, Miguel. You've proven that you're an expert in the topic, but you also have an artistic sensitivity, because on your first slide there was a sculpture by Bigland, who's a Norwegian sculptor. Fascinates me. Let me introduce Erin Williams, who's vice president of this scientific committee, and she will reflect upon what we've just heard to start the Q&A that we'll have next for up to 20 minutes. Voy a hablar en inglés, so I'll speak in English.
No quiero torturarles con mis males.
I don't want to torture you with my poor Spanish. I really loved your presentation. Thank you so very much. I'm fascinated and so curious about the different approaches that we can discuss to get rid of gender-based violence, especially when we are faced with this idea that culture is part of the problem itself. How do we change culture? How do we enter or introduce these changes so that we can approach the topic from a group perspective and not individually? I think the key is that sometimes we try to do so, and the institutional response would be filing a complaint, and that's the mistake. We need to understand that if violence is understood as something normal, complaints will be pointless because it's not about criticizing it as something abnormal, but this is supposed to be a complaint that has negative consequences from a legal point of view compared to the abuser. But this is asking too much from a reality that is built just on the opposite. As a matter of fact, we know 70% of all women that come out of GBV, they come through separation, not through complaining or reporting it. The criticism, the level of criticism gets them to such a state that they separate themselves from their partner. It's not that they are not aware of reporting it, but they don't want any negative consequences for their kids and many more things. So thinking that making reporting easier or giving information on reporting, that means that we will change the whole social construction without working on changing the culture itself, it is a mistake. We need to promote said care and response beyond reporting. An abused woman is the only victim of a crime where she needs to prove it's been a victim to get any care. If I get stabbed and I get to the hospital, no one will ask me whether I stabbed myself, it was an accident, I get treatment. No need to justify or certify that I've been attacked. And yet an abused woman needs a restraining order or someone justified, and someone who's not an expert in violence, a court member, a DA, so that some care services to get rid of her violence can be started from an employment or a psychological point of view. So it's a poor design. This design cannot work. It works some cases. By the way, what we have is very good, but we need to enlarge it in order to tackle a problem that goes way farther from those individual items in different circumstances. You mentioned culture, you mentioned sexist behaviors, and I have a question myself, and that's the role of social media. As part of what you said, I guess they play a significant role, and more important every day, in favor, against it. How does it qualify what you said? Social media. Nuria Varela will refer to media, and she is an expert in the topic. And, well, social media are a reflection of what we are as a culture, as a society, a reflection of sexism. It's not just all about sexism at a given time, but actually they show aggressiveness to get into other people's accounts, to attack them and question them, not from the point of view of reflection, but a humiliation or direct attack. Social media are playing a negative role for the empowerment of sexism or post-sexism, but it's also a useful tool to make sure that we can share knowledge and equality and role models and references to keep building on. I guess there is way too much impunity for that hiding, that fighting for macho chauvinism or hatred attacks that is not. They are not questioned enough when we talk about GBV or sexism, contrary to other kinds of violence. We see that every day. We should not be so permissive and lenient, because it's not only problems about a given fact, but actually those messages reinforce the social references we already have. It's much easier to consolidate what we have instead of changing it. So the impact of social media for sexism is more efficacious because they lead to confusion. That's the target of sexism. It's not given an alternative, but they need confusion. Confusion is doubt, doubt is distance, that's passivity, and everything stays the same. And if it all stays the same, it's all about inequality, it's all about sexism. So we need to be a bit more critical about the use of social media in empowerment, hatred against women, and gender-based violence. Any questions for the speaker? No questions? Yes. There's one back there. There is a topic that today has not been touched upon so far for GBV that I would like to put forward so that all other panelists discuss it. I'm Rosalba Duran, I come from Colombia, and I mean transgender violence. Violence suffered by women who, when they are adolescent, they feel they are trapped in a different body and they want to be men. And as men can, or boys cannot cry, they are abused as well. And this is also abuse that is based on gender hatred. Same the other way around. Boys who realize they are trapped in the wrong body, they want to become girls, and they are abused for that at home or school and by the society. In a country that in recent weeks has not been an example of sanity, as the country I come from, but the number of women victims of GBV is only a pity that people become figures, but we see that those figures go up, and we need to understand that there are boys deciding to dress as women, and they are attacked and killed in daylight because they've dared, as even religious leaders say, because they've dared to go against God's will, trying to be what God has not made. By the way, this is just quoting them. And yes, I fully agree that we need to address GBV against women, but we cannot forget these other minorities, especially in such a beautiful event that brings us back to being humane. And when we have such a wonderful speaker, and so we need to come to terms with this other part of what we want from bioethics, the right to being different and respect to plurality. Thank you very much. Yes, I should like to say that it is true that we need to look into it, we need to respond to that kind of violence, that it comes out of the same situation with some nuances as we've tried to explain the origin of culture, but men feel now that what's happening, it's been happening for some time now. It's not a fight for times or spaces. That was the initial approach when it was said that we should change the relational model and try to better redistribute time and space. But since 1980 or so, what feminism has made possible is for the discussion to go beyond that material question, tangible question. And there is a debate on identities, men and women, different ways of being a man, different ways of being a woman. And men, what they're trying with this kind of violence is to defend their own identity, the traditional model of masculinity, and defend it through violence to be more effective in the result and be better recognized as men in their behavior and approach. When men say this law in Spain is against men, and they don't say criminal law goes against people, because the argument should be the same. If what you're questioning, it is a potential punishment through a rule or a standard, and that the argument that this law against violence sentences men because they attack women, it goes against every man and not only abusers, it should be the same argument to say that criminal law goes against people and not only those people who are criminals. And why do men feel identify themselves as men with those that abuse? Because abusers abuse because they are men, because they've built their identity. You can use it to abuse or not, but the identity is the same. As kids, we've been told the use of violence is a good way to sort out some conflicts, and some people put it into practice. Not just by working violently in face of a conflict, the same as happens with violent partnerships or in equal societies or in businesses, because sexist, it's in culture everywhere, not just in women relationship, but they use conflicts and they turn to violence so that it is beneficial for them. So the great lie of sexism is to think that behavior is just the one-off result of an isolated case. When they say he murdered his wife after an argument, no, it's after a whole life of violence. But it seems it was just one heavy argument that led, there was the cause, the root for that homicide. Same happens within society. What it's done is placing it at a given time. The problem happens at a given time, and men find themselves questions as men through these standards and criticism that feminism executes every day on that violent and sexist culture. Maybe I could ask Dr. Palacios, whenever there's been a conference organized by the International Bioethics Society, the women-men ratio has been so outstanding as this one. How many men in the room? 10? Men in the room? When we say poverty, is it 90% women, 10% men? When we discuss all the kinds of situation, bioethical situation, ratios as unequal? I don't think so. I work on several disciplines and I don't find it. The fact that there are no more men in the room, it proves that they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel concerned about this kind of approach and reflections and progression to eliminate inequality, to change this all. So this is all part of the culture, and we need to be aware of it. Men are not in this room because they don't want to. No one is asked for femininity or masculinity test to come in. They are not here because they don't want to, and if they don't want to, there is a reason for that, and we need to be aware of that. They are not in here, and they are in no other field, either as citizens, people, or professionals, to properly tackle using professionalism and accountability to deal with the consequences of violence. Only 9% of all the injuries in hospitals are reported, and 49% of women murdered after filing a report. Whereas the professional response there is not there because no one's taken the time to be trained, be educated, to be responsible and accountable in responding to it. And this is a good reflection of the society we've tried to present here as the main causing factor, not final causing factor, but initial causing factor of violence, LGBT. Any more questions? No more questions? Then I have a last question myself. Usually we say there is no disease in medicine, I mean, there are only sick people, and this is something usually quote. Considering this, and just as in simple terms and abridged, and all the abuse that has been in the schoolroom, so what preventions could we set up, especially in the field of education? the greatest preventive element is education, because in the end would be breaking down all those cultural references that lead to identities where violence is understood as some normal, to work with it, and normal when breaking down this idea of a romantic love. We have great experts in the room on that idea, but it is all about trying to have a different identity. But basically, as part of this situation, which is generic as I understand it, we need to focus on men because women are changing. Just have a look at those people in this room, women in this room. You've changed so much compared to the role that women had 15 to 20 years ago. You're changing your role and your functions and your presence and your influence. Men are doing just the same. But we are not part of the change, and said asymmetric transformation is being translated into a greater deal of violence. So the change that is happening in women, in girls, is being translated into a sexist reaction in boys that are going back to more traditional positions. Because for boys, being a man means not being a woman. And when women are not what they used to be, they don't know what they are anymore, men, I mean, because the reference is not being like you, but you are not what you used to be, so what's me? So if you are not what you were, because you are me and I cannot be you, who am I? So you go backwards to those spaces where they cannot be, which are much more sexist environments. So men's reaction that is happening is going backwards, but women's reaction is forward. And this leads to a greater deal of confrontation, and we see how figures go up. Since 2006, that was 400,000 cases, 700,000 in 2015. It's true that you get out of the loop sooner, but we are not avoiding violence. So I guess prevention is based on education and awareness raising for the media, campaigns, actions. We need to work harder on awareness, because that's educating present people so that they are prepared for the future. But awareness is the way we get their attention. We do not tolerate some behaviors that are being tolerated so far. The university are working on a harassment protocol, and there is such a high internal resistance to have it approved, when 22% of all students, female students, are harassed by their teachers. And instead of tackling the reality, we try to minimize it. Threat is an argument. Any student will threaten you if you fail them. So arguments that are not real, when used to keep things as they are, this will not bring us forward. This critical review, that's something we need. And we need it not just as a theoretical argument, but also for our relations. I think prevention, that it's based on education, but also action and awareness, is paramount to make sure that we don't follow the same pathway. Thank you very much, Miguel. I will now give the floor to Erin so that she finalizes this panel with some conclusions or summarizing what we've heard. Thank you very much. Thank you to the co-chair for starting without me. I was getting my presentation for later on. Thank you very much also Miguel Lorente for his kind presentation. I really thank you for all the context you've given us, trying and the background, trying to understand the factors that lead to violence and cultural standards, institutional standards, so that violence is perpetuated. And I hope that as the conference moves forward, we will then focus on what we can do as a group to break up that violence cycle. Thank you very much.